Welcome, brothers. I'm JK Amazy, head coach and founder of the Porn Reboot system. You can learn more about us by visiting elevatedrecovery.org. On YouTube, I release 4 videos every week. So if you're trying to end your out-of-control behavior with pornography, masturbation, or even if you have some other sort of sexually compulsive behavior, then go ahead and subscribe. And when you do so, make sure you click on the little bell icon so that you get notifications each time that I release a video.
In the YouTube app, go to notifications and turn on subscriptions. In the settings, go to notifications and scroll to the YouTube app and allow notifications.
Now, back to the topic at hand. We're talking about getting rid of unwanted sexual fantasies. But you're like, wait a minute, did you say by masturbating? Yes, I did say by masturbating. So I want to drop a couple of disclaimers. In the community section here on our YouTube channel, I put up a survey a couple of months ago asking what sort of videos you guys wanted to see more of. And overwhelmingly, everybody wanted more coping strategies. So I'm delivering and I'm going all the way. However, this particular strategy is risky, as you already know, and it's a strategy that does not apply to everybody. So it may not apply to you if you are a man who is not sexually active with other people. So if you're not in a relationship, if you're not having sex with other people, if you are a virgin, it probably does not apply to you. If you are at a stage of your reboot where you're not masturbating and you're doing pretty good, you're like, JK, I'm making progress. I don't see any reason for me to do this. I don't want to have anything to do with masturbation at all. Then this is probably not for you. This is for men who are currently either still struggling with their out of control behavior. That means you're still slipping here and there. And also for men who have recently relapsed and are stuck in a relapse. But all of you must have one thing in common. And that means that you must be experiencing an unwanted fantasy. What's an unwanted fantasy? An unwanted fantasy is any sort of fantasy which for you falls out of the bounds of what is considered normal, healthy sexual behavior. And this includes the sort of pornography you watch. So if this fantasy, whether it's a fantasy that you view on a porn site or it's a fantasy that you bring up in your mind and you masturbate to, whatever it might be, if it makes you feel shame once you're done with your orgasm, if it makes you feel that you're not a normal person, that, hey, this might be a little bit deviant behavior, if it makes you feel disgust at yourself, like you're disgusted at yourself and you loathe yourself having this, then it falls within the definition of an unwanted fantasy. Now, first of all, there's nothing wrong with fantasy in general. I've said before that this is absolutely healthy behavior. All of us engage in it. The only problem with fantasy these days is that we feel that if other people hear about our fantasies, they would judge us because they think that, hey, you obviously want to act out on that, when we don't. And it's all been made more complicated by high-speed internet pornography. Well, why? Well, that's because high-speed internet pornography literally pulls the fantasies out of our minds and makes them real. And the worst part is people watch them. And now in our culture, it's almost as if porn is normal. Not almost as if porn is normal. And not only is porn normal, people watch amateur pornography where fantasies are being acted out, and you start feeling that, you know what, people do this. Like, I'll look into comment sections and you'll be like, well, I think people do that stuff. I believe people do that stuff. And this messes up your arousal template, because if you feel that a fantasy being acted out on a screen or by women who are trying to get money from you, women and men who are trying to get money from you, you're more likely to believe that this is normal behavior. And you might even act out on it, okay? So that's who it's for, and that is what I define as unwanted behavior. Now, as I move forward with this, even though it's a very simple process, you might feel a little bit uncomfortable, especially if you're one of those men who hasn't slipped, one of those men who is making great progress in his reboot, or one of those men who's just strongly against masturbation. Again, this is not for everybody. Finally, this is not an excuse for you to slip. So watch at your own risk, okay? Tomorrow and the day after, or rather later on this week, I'll be sharing 2 other methods that do not involve masturbation for controlling unwanted fantasies. Now for this one, the first step is to accept the fact that this particular fantasy is unwanted. So actually spend some time, sit down and go like, okay, what's this fantasy? Maybe you're a straight man who watches gay pornography, but you're not a gay man, right? We have another video where I talk about the test you can take to find out whether this is a porn-induced fetish or whether maybe you are actually gay or bisexual and you don't know that. So I'll leave a link for it in the description below this video. Maybe it's some other things. I don't want to trigger anybody, so I won't dive into it. But going by the definition that this is something that for you is out of the bounds of normal and you don't feel good when you're done orgasming to the fantasy, define it. That's the first step. The second step is when you are masturbating, and I don't care what the circumstance is, I'm going to assume that it is a slip, okay? When you are masturbating, chances are you're going to be masturbating to that unwanted fantasy. Maybe you've escalated to a certain level of your porn addiction. I have another video of that. Maybe you're at level 5, maybe you're at level 6. Continue doing that. But once you get to the point of orgasm, I want you to change your fantasy to something that you are more comfortable with. Now, if you're in a relationship, if you're having sex with somebody, if you have intimacy with somebody, whatever the case may be, change the fantasy at the point of orgasm to something you're comfortable with. It might just be having sex with your wife or with your girlfriend or somebody that you've had sex with in the past. But it's not an unwanted fantasy and it's not deviant in your mind by any stretch of the imagination. Do that. But the next part is key. As soon as you are done, when you are limp, when you are satiated, typically at this point you might feel a little bit disgusted with yourself. That is if you were masturbating to fantasy, you might feel some shame. But this time you've switched it, so you might feel a little bit like, oh, that was not the best orgasm that I could have had. I want you to immediately begin the fantasy again, the unwanted fantasy, while you're limp. This means that if you were watching pornography and you hit pause right after you masturbated while you're limp, I want you to go back to whatever it was that you were watching. Maybe you went to a tab where you were watching pornography that you were more comfortable with and you orgasmed to that. Well, go back to the other tab with that unwanted fetish or that unwanted fantasy. Watch it again. And I want you to completely watch it for about 10 minutes. And don't change to anything else. Once 10 minutes is up, go ahead and close it. Regardless of how uncomfortable you feel, it doesn't matter what your thoughts are. I just want you to watch it while you are in a limp state. Each time you find yourself slipping or relapsing to an unwanted fantasy, I want you to do the same thing, whether it's with pornography or whether you're doing it in your mind. Now, the very important disclaimer here is each time you do this, you must switch from the unwanted fantasy to something which you are more comfortable with. And again, remember my disclaimer, this is not an excuse for you to slip. This is not an excuse for you to go deeper into your fantasy. And this is not an exercise you should try if you already know where this is going to go. And what I mean by that is some of you have done that before. Some of you have watched a particular genre of pornography which is based on an unwanted fantasy and you just didn't want to orgasm to it because of that feeling. So you switched to an image of your wife or you switched to an image of your girlfriend and you're like, JK, I've done this before and it doesn't work for me. So if you're one of those guys who's tried playing that game, you've never done it as an exercise, then please don't try that. This is for guys who are dealing with a specific unwanted fantasy, who are currently in a slip or relapse or just not making much progress, but they want to get rid of that unwanted fantasy. When you do this over time, even though you're relapsing, even though you're slipping, you'll start noticing that your unwanted fantasies become less and less preferable. But again, the key is trying to engage in the unwanted fantasy when you are limp. Now the big question I get is, JK, what if I start getting aroused again when I start viewing that sort of pornography again, or when I start imagining it again? Chances are you're not going to. It's very rare, especially if you're doing it immediately after you have orgasmed to a fantasy that you are more comfortable with. Alright, so as I mentioned, later on in the week I'm going to be speaking about 2 other techniques that you can apply that are going to help you get rid of unwanted fantasies. Again, I want to reiterate, and I know I sound like a broken record, that this might sound like a deviation from some of the principles that I teach here at Porn Reboot, and if it sounds like that to you, it simply means that this is probably not one of the coping strategies that you want to apply to yourself. It is also not a reflection on the Porn Reboot system. We apply different strategies to different men, and this is something that only applies to a few men, and it may not work for you. So let's remember that moving forward. I'm JK, your brother in the struggle. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Now, if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, go ahead and ask them in the comment section below, and I'll speak to you later on in the week.